Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review a cheaper handheld that recently came out called the XU10. And as you can see, this is a vertical handheld and looks a lot like others on the market. However, there are some pretty interesting components to this one that we'll dive into in this review. And these are some of my favorite videos to make because you never know when you buy one of these cheaper devices whether or not it's going to be awesome or terrible. And well, I'm happy to report that this is actually not that bad for the price point. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and check this one out. Okay, full disclosure, this is a review unit sent over to me from KeepRetro.com. They're a third-party reseller for a lot of these cheaper handhelds. Anyway, as you can see on their website, they are asking $70 for this handheld, and it does come with free shipping. And that base model will come with a 64GB card that's preloaded with games. In fact, that's the size that we'll be reviewing here today. However, if you'd like, there are also larger SD card sizes for an additional charge if you want to have even more games loaded up. Personally, I always recommend getting the cheapest version possible and then loading up your own game files instead. Now in terms of colors, there are three different options. There's a dark gray, as well as a darker purple, which we'll be reviewing here today. And finally, there's a white color option as well. Okay, next let's get into the specifications, which I think you'll find to be pretty familiar. Number one, in terms of the screen, this is a typical 3.5-inch IPS LCD with a 4:3 aspect ratio and a 480p resolution. Now things get interesting when we look at the CPU. Now initially I thought this was going to be an RK3326, which is a chipset we've seen a lot over the past few years. But instead it looks like they're using the upgraded version called the RK3326S. And as far as I can tell, the major difference here is that it can run at a higher clock speed. And it turns out when it comes to some of those higher end systems, the difference is night and day from the older RK3326 to the one we have here today. And we'll talk about that more when we get into the gameplay testing. Now everything else here on the device is pretty standard. We've got a gig of DDR4 RAM, and then we also have a 3000 mAh battery. The spec sheet here says that you should expect between 6 and 8 hours of gameplay, but I found it to be more like 4 to 6 for me. Anyway, that's just a quick rundown of some of these specs. Let's move over to the unboxing. Okay, the box itself is pretty plain, but one thing I did notice is the brand name. And I recognize this company name as a reseller on AliExpress. I don't think they actually make handheld devices like this. And we'll discuss this more in a few minutes, but before that, let's take a look inside the box. Inside, we've got our standard fare, so a USB-A to USB-C charging cable, and then it also comes with a screen protector, and then a quick start guide just to tell you what buttons do what. Now let's take a look at the device itself, and I actually really like this dark purple color. Initially, I thought it was going to have a metallic finish based on the renders, but it really has more of a matte texture to it, which I really like. Now right off the bat, there are some things that are really interesting about this one. To start, the power and reset buttons are on the back of the device. And I kind of like this because they are well out of the way, you'll never accidentally press them. Another interesting aspect are these holes in the back, which are ventilation for the CPU. Initially I thought it was a speaker, but no, they've got a mono speaker right here on the front. Another thing I noticed is the back buttons, the shoulder and trigger buttons, are on a shelf that's not as prominent as I was thinking it would be. So overall, it does give a kind of slim appearance to the handheld. And then finally, the fourth thing that really kind of caught me off guard about the XU10 are these little ridges up here on the top. I'm not sure what kind of practical or cosmetic purpose this has. I can't think of a handheld that had these shelves up here on top like this. Anyway, if you do know, let me know in the comments because I have no idea why these are here. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the buttons on the front. The start and select buttons have a rubber membrane connection and feel a little bit squishy, and it's a very similar feeling to the D-pad. But the interesting design here is that the cardinal points are not connected to one another. So instead it reminds me a lot of something like a PlayStation controller. But bear in mind that this D-pad is just one single piece of plastic. So instead, the design here is actually closer to something like a PS5 controller. And I would say here the travel and pivot actually feels fairly good in the hand. But of course, it all comes down to how it actually performs when playing a game. So we'll start with the contra test. I'm going to push down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right and see whether or not the character moves. And as you can see, the character really doesn't move at all unless you move your thumb up closer to center. And so it is possible to move the character once you get higher up, but if you're going to go straight down, it will not work. But all the same, when playing this game, it's not so hard to hit the diagonals. And so I would say that Contra is a completely playable experience for me. Not only will I be able to duck down when I need to without having to move my character left or right, but then when I want to fire in a diagonal direction, I had no problem whatsoever. So I'd say it pretty clearly passes the Contra test, at least for me. Now that being said, I did test a bunch of other diagonals and I found those to be a little bit harder to hit than I would like. So for example, with Castlevania 3, I did struggle to go up the stairs. Now to be fair, going up the stairs in Castlevania 3 just sucks altogether, but all the same, this was a little bit worse than I found it with other D-pads. Again, it's not a deal breaker for me, but definitely something that I found to be less than ideal. And then finally, let's do a Street Fighter test. This is Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. And here I want to make sure that everything is nice and Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. And I would say here, yeah, it's actually pretty good. I'm not very used to using a D-pad of this style with fighting games, but I feel like even after a couple rounds, I was getting better. And so this is something that I think over time I would have no problem with whatsoever. So all things considered, I think this D-pad is definitely passable. It's not something I would write home about, but all the same, it's definitely good. Next, let's check out the face buttons. These also have a rubber membrane connection, so a very classic retro style. And they're nice and responsive, but still having a good amount of travel as well. In fact, even though this is the first device from this company, these are better buttons than what I find on a typical Powkitty device. So if anything, I would say it's almost in competition with Anbernic in terms of just button quality. It's maybe a little bit behind, but all the same, I think it's still pretty good. So when it comes down to it, both the combination of D-pad and face buttons are very decent on this handheld. And considering the retro games you'll be playing on here, this is the control scheme you're probably going to be using the most. Now another thing I didn't notice until later is the A, B, and XY pattern is actually the Xbox style and not Nintendo. And that's very rare in retro handhelds, but you can configure the buttons yourself if you'd like in the settings. Next, we'll talk about these analog sticks. Now initially I thought, man, this is the dumbest place to put them, but it turns out that having them inset into the device itself is actually not that uncomfortable. The analog sticks are your typical Nintendo Switch Joy-Con style sticks, and it's one of those things where you either tolerate them or you hate them. No one really loves these things. But all the same, they are very cheap to replace in case something goes wrong with them, and honestly, they get the job done. Now, considering the catalog of games we have to work with, you're not going to find a lot of twin-stick shooters to actually play on this device, but there's a couple here and there, like you could configure Coded Arms to work with a dual analog setup like this, and there's a couple dual analog games on the PS1 that you could play, like that Spanish game, Ape Escape. Either way, I found this control scheme to be pretty comfortable with a dual stick setup because these sticks are centered into the device. But for me personally, I don't see myself using them very often. Okay, before we get further into the device, another thing that just really struck me about the shape and form is the overall thickness of it. It actually feels really good and premium. And it took me a while to figure out why and what it reminded me of the most, but it turns out that it's actually the Analogue Pocket. Now in terms of size, this one is quite a bit smaller, but it turns out that the thickness and the roundedness is really reminiscent of the Analogue Pocket. In fact, there's less than a half of a millimeter difference between them. And so the more I tested and played the XU10, the more I was impressed by the overall feel of it. And that's because to me, it felt like a really premium handheld. It has a solid build quality to it and just reminds me a lot of the Analogue Pocket. And considering that this device is a third of the price of that one and can play 10 times as many games, that's pretty awesome. Okay, let's take a look at the rest of the device. On the left side, we have an expanded storage SD card slot, and then we have our volume rocker up and down. Now on the top, we just have two USB-C ports, and the labels for them are on the back of the device. You can see that one is set up for external controllers and the other one will be for charging. Now on the right side, we have a headphone jack and then a G button. This is basically our function button. And then we also have an LED indicator. It's kind of odd that it's on the side, but I actually kind of like this compared to other handhelds where the LED is kind of like shooting right into your eyeballs. Instead, this one's on the side and very subdued. So I actually kind of appreciate its placement overall. Anyway, finally on the right side, we also have our primary SD card slot. One thing worth noting is they've mislabeled the English here. So even though this one says external, it's actually your internal or system card. And of course, same thing on the other side. It says internal, but this one is actually your external or storage card. Either way, this really doesn't affect anything other than just the cosmetics of the device. Now on the bottom, you can see there's a little bit of a curved texture right here. I don't really have any opinions about this one way or the other, but one thing that I do really like is the ribbed feeling here on the back. In fact, the design here feels very 90s. I think a lot of other companies have tried to replicate this, but this one is probably the closest I've ever seen. And I'm also a fan of the plastic texture here. It doesn't seem to be very smudgy at all. So I think in terms of just kind of fit and feel, it's actually a pretty good setup. Another thing I noticed that I really like is that these shoulder buttons are very quiet. Let me give you a listen here really quickly. Now to give you an idea of context, I'm going to show another handheld right here. This is the R35S. And so yes, you can see it's a night and day difference between that one and the XU10. And I think it really goes to show that the build quality on this device is actually fairly decent. Now, all told, I probably spent a week or two messing around with this device here and there. And one of the things that really surprised me about it is that even though I wouldn't consider this to be a small handheld, all the same, it's actually pretty pocketable. And I think the reason why this surprised me is that because it's a vertical handheld, and most of these will have like these really big jutting shelves on the back in order to place the shoulder and trigger buttons. Instead, this one feels like it's done a really good balance between the two. It's still very comfortable to use those buttons on the back, and you can rest your index fingers on there as well. But all the same, they didn't make it so prominent that it would actually mess you up when you try to put it into your pocket. And so I would say, other than like the Mio Mini Plus maybe being a little bit more pocketable, this is one of the most pocketable vertical handhelds that you can buy right now. So yeah, I really like the size and feel of this one. I think it's way above its weight class in that regard. Now, a couple videos ago, I made a review of this device right here. This is the yellow version of the RGB30. And this is one that I bought myself on the Powkitty website and just did a quick video kind of showing off how good it looked. Now, the really surprising thing about the order when it arrived to me here at my house was that the Powkitty RGB30 was not the only device in the package. Even though this was the only thing that I bought, Powkitty snuck in another handheld, and it happened to be another XU10. First of all, it is pretty creepy that they knew that it was me and then they sent a device in there. I literally thought that when buying a device from Powkitty, they didn't realize that it was actually me buying it. So I think I'm gonna have to come up with an alias next time I buy a handheld from them. Either way, because they did ship this one over to me unsolicited, let's actually open it up and take a look inside. And there are some key differences. Number one, the branding is different on the box, and it also comes with a cloth sack, and there's also a microSD card reader inside. So it's kind of weird that there is some variation between the branding as well as the pack-ins, but I think at the end of the day, there's really no difference between the handhelds themselves. Now, looking at the device itself, there doesn't seem to be any difference between the two of them, other than the most obvious difference, which is the color. And for me personally, I don't really mind the white color. I think that the white and black looks pretty sharp. But all the same, I think the purple one just has a lot more character to it. Either way, I hope it was at least helpful to see two of the three colorways. And I guess thanks to Powkitty for sending this over. It's kind of weird. But all the same, I did want to tear one of these down, so let's go ahead and use this one as the guinea pig. Getting it open is pretty easy. It's just 4 T6 Torx screws, and then just a matter of taking a guitar pick and going around the sides to undo all the clips. Now, there's a couple things I wanted to verify. Number one is that yes, this is where the CPU is up here in the top, and it looks like they put a little copper shim up here for a heatsink. And yeah, I guess they put those ventilation holes there for that same reason. Other than that, the PCB itself looks pretty plain. You can see we have our two SD card readers on each side, and then further up top by the CPU, we can see our two little RAM chips. And it looks to be on the top right here. This is probably where they would have put a Wi-Fi chip if they were going to put one in. So if you were comfortable with soldering and wanted to put your own Wi-Fi chip inside, you definitely have the pad for it. So really that's about it when it comes to hardware. Now let's start talking about the software experience. And first things first, I want to boot up the device and let you get a feel for the intro music that happens every single time you start it up. So yeah, I find that to be super annoying, and unfortunately I wasn't able to figure out how to turn this down either. And so every time I booted up this device, it would play that full sound effect at full volume, and it was just really unbearable. Speaking of unbearable, the boot up time here is pretty slow as well. It's about 35-36 seconds altogether, which is probably twice of what it should be if they had a good custom firmware inside. Either way, this is what the user interface is going to look like. It's going to have a series of pages or tabs that you can go through to pick your game. And this kind of design was really prevalent a few years ago on like Pandora's Box machines, but it is kind of rare to see something like this on a handheld. That being said, they have a ton of different systems on here, basically any of the emulated systems you would typically see, and there's quite a few of the less popular systems as well. So you'll find things like Amstrad CPC, Atari 7200, and Atari Lynx, as well as the Open Beats of Rage catalog, and then the Ninja Turtle Shredder's Revenge port for some reason as well. Either way, yeah, there's a huge catalog on this, even though I'm only using a 64GB card. Now, this is actually an emulation station interface, and if you tap on that G or function button on the right side, it'll bring up an options menu that'll probably look pretty familiar if you've ever tried one of these handhelds before. Within here, you can do things like map your controller for a specific system, and additionally, under the game collection settings, you can turn off certain systems if you don't want them visible. In addition, you can do some other things like change change out the language of the menu system as well as the brightness. But all told, it's a pretty bare bones menu system. The only other option there is the quit menu, and this is where you'll go in if you want to restart the device or shut it down. So all told, it looks like they forked a version of Batocera and then really tried to dumb it down to make sure that no one could mess up the settings. Now, depending on the system that you hover over when you press that G button, it'll give you different menu options. For example, when using Nintendo 64, if we press that menu button, it'll bring up an emulators options section. And here we have a choice of 4 different emulators to use when playing Nintendo 64. And so that can come in handy depending on what game you're trying to play, but to be honest, the default one works pretty well. In addition, you can also go in here and change out your shaders and aspect ratio, all those other things that you usually can do within Emulation Station. It really depends on the system that you're trying to mess with and whether or not those options are going to be available. Either way, yeah, it's a pretty simple setup and I don't really mind that at all. Now it gets even more interesting when you try to quit out of a game. You press the function button again, and here you can see that they have stylized a different version of RetroArch. And this one has very minimal settings tweaks available, but there are a few options here and there, like being able to load or save a state, or you can turn on cheats or swap out a disk if you're using a multi-disc game. And then of course, most importantly is the exit button. This is how you're going to leave the game and get back to the menu. So I guess in a nutshell, I'm not really opposed to this simple setup that we have here. It is kind of a bummer that some of these configurations are hidden so that we can't get to them, but I think that for the vast majority of users, this is all the kind of settings tweaks they're ever going to need. And admittedly, getting out of a game is pretty fast. You just press in that menu button, press the up button, get to exit, and then press A and you're good to go. So next, let's get into the game testing and see what kind of performance you can expect from the XU10. But before we get too far into the weeds, I do want to note a couple things. Number one, I found that for the vast majority of these handheld systems, they've applied a shader on here, and I don't think it looks very good. This is one of those XBR types of shaders that really kind of smooths out everything and makes it look a little bit weird. Now, thankfully, changing out the shader set is pretty easy. You just have to go back into the main menu, and then while in the menu, you're going to press that G button, and then select Emulator Options. And within here, you'll find these shaders set, and most of these have been set to what they're calling Magic X, which I think might be the brand of this device. I'm not really sure. Either way, you can browse through here and pick a different shader or turn it off at the very top if you'd like. For me personally, for the handheld systems, I like to use one called LCD3X, and so that's the one I'm going to choose because it does give you a nice LCD grid. Another thing you can do while in the emulator settings, you can change out the colorization for Game Boy. So in this example, I'm going to go and choose the one that says Game Boy DMG. And that's really about it. You just have to go and do this for every system, only one time, it'll save it after that. And so now every time I start up a Game Boy game, not only will it have this nice LCD grid, but it's also going to show that Game Boy DMG colorization. Anyway, from a performance standpoint, as expected, Game Boy Color, all these systems are going to play at full speed, absolutely no problem. But also bear in mind that by default, it's showing it at a 4:3 aspect ratio, so that's another thing you can go back in the menu settings and change. Either way, when it comes to playing systems like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, I think it's a really good fit. After all, we've got a vertical handheld, and yeah, it just looks really nice. And there are a variety of other handheld systems available on here preloaded. Neo Geo Pocket, Neo Geo Pocket Color, and even Atari Lynx and WonderSwan are on here as well. It also looks to have the full Game Boy Advance catalog on here, so if you want to play any of your favorite systems from this catalog, you can play them as well. And I think all the systems look pretty good on this 3.5-inch screen. In fact, the colors are nice and vibrant, and it gets pretty bright as well, and so I've got no complaints about the screen either way. Now, when it comes to home console systems, we've got a lot of choice. In addition to your typical ones like the Nintendo Entertainment System, they also have systems like Atari 7200, so if you want to play the full catalog, they actually have it loaded up. In addition, we've got a wide variety of Genesis and 32X games, not really any Sega CD games, you'd have to load those yourself, but either way, all these are going to play just fine. Same goes with Super Nintendo, all these games are going to play at full speed, including those that are harder to run like Yoshi's Island. And for me personally, I didn't find this to be that surprising because the RK3326 could play all these Super Nintendo games as well. There's also a ton of arcade games preloaded on the system, so if you want to try some of these out, yeah, they're all on here as well. And it's going to be your typical performance where all of your 80s and early 90s games are going to play just fine, basically all the way up through the CPS3 catalog. However, when you try to go past that, like Killer Instinct or maybe Street Fighter the movie, yeah, those are a little bit too hard. Next up is PlayStation 1, and I found that all of these games played just fine, even the harder ones to run like Bloody Roar 2. Again, this is very typical of the RK3326, so it makes sense that a more powerful chip like this is going to play these as well. Now there's a bunch of Nintendo DS games on here as well, and they all work fine. But of note, this is not a touchscreen, so you're not going to be able to use any sort of touchscreen functionality, but they do have the ability to swap the screens mapped to the L2 and R2 buttons. So if there is a game that'll allow you to either play it vertically or horizontally or one screen at a time, this will look pretty good. And like I mentioned, these games run just fine, so it's not a performance thing, it's just really a functionality issue. But for the most part, any DS games that will use regular controls and rely on only one screen at a time are going to be great. Okay, next I want to start moving into these systems that are harder to emulate. We're going to start with Nintendo 64. And here I found that the easy to play games like Diddy Kong Racing actually play at full speed, and that does make sense because this was kind of the limit of what you could expect with the RK3326. However, I was surprised to find that any other Nintendo 64 game I tried actually played really well. I'd get a little bit of crackling here and there, but that's really just me being picky. Overall, I would say from a performance standpoint, every Nintendo 64 game I tried was perfectly playable. In fact, the performance here was sometimes better than what I found on the RK3566 chipset. So I was pretty surprised to find that this $70 device actually outperformed devices that can cost upwards of like $125. Now that being said, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. I think that the standalone movement core that they're using is not quite perfect. And some games will present bugs, including A Bug's Life, no pun intended. Either way, I'm pretty confident in saying that if you want to play Nintendo 64, this is actually a pretty great solution. It's not going to be perfect, but most games are going to play well. And I found it to be a similar experience with Dreamcast. Now, unfortunately, within the settings, there's no option to actually show you the frames per second, so I don't really know what's going on here. But I can tell you, at least from just the feel of the device and how much audio crackling we're getting, this is actually fairly good. And like I mentioned, it far exceeds what I was expecting from this chipset. In fact, it does kind of push it into the next generation of the RK3566. Let me give you an example here with Soul Calibur. We're going to play it in full audio so you can get a feel for the sound, but then also the audio crackling or lack thereof. So yeah, like I was saying, this is not perfect, but it is still pretty darn good. And so if you are looking to play most Dreamcast games, I think they're going to run fine here. Okay, so next up we have Sega Saturn, and you probably know where I'm going to be going with this one as well. To start, when it comes to lightweight or 2D games, yeah, these play just fine as expected. You know, the RK3326, especially when running something like ArcOS, was basically playable with these games. I will say that they do run better here with no hint of slowdown. I was also surprised to find that some of the more intensive games, you know, Nights into Dreams, as well as Panzer Dragoon 2, these also played at full speed as well. Now, when I say full speed, I don't mean like 60 frames per second, but in the fact that it doesn't feel like it has a lot of tangible slowdown. So I would say this is definitely not a handheld for Saturn purists, but all the same, if you just want the thrill of playing a Saturn game, it's definitely here. Okay, and finally, the hardest to run system they have on this device preloaded is Sony PSP. And again, this one really kind of exceeded my expectations when it comes to that baseline RK3326 performance. And so here I would say it's probably a 50-50 split in the fact that yes, many games will play, but it's not going to be perfect for all of them. And unfortunately, if you try to go into the emulator settings here, there's not really much you can do in terms of tweaking the performance. So if anything, it makes me hope that there is a custom firmware coming sometime down the line, because that would allow us to make some game-specific tweaks for some of these PSP games within the emulator. And I think if we're able to dial in the settings for each game, you'll probably get a lot more games playable. However, as it stands, you know, the default settings are not half bad for most games. But there are quite a few that did present some problems. For example, here with God of War Chains of Olympus, you can see that whatever hacks they're using right here has basically eliminated the entire sky from the screen, and it definitely feels like they're using some sort of frame skip hack or cheat. So while the gameplay is fast, I wouldn't consider it to be smooth, and this is definitely not an experience I would recommend for others. And like I mentioned, there's not much you can do within the settings. If we press the menu button, you can see we have the ability to save and load a state, and then we can also adjust the control configuration. But other than that, you can't get into the actual PSP menu. So we are pretty limited when it comes to configurations within the stock firmware, and we'll have to see whether or not anyone in the community can come up with something that will improve that experience. Okay, and last note before we start wrapping up, I did want to check out the SD card, so I put it in my computer, and it comes up with two partitions, one called Magic X, and this is going to be your system partition, so it's going to have all sorts of Linux files. You don't want to mess with it. However, it does have a games partition, and if we open that up, you can see we have our full ROMs list. So this will be super handy if you want to trim down the games list. After all, for example, with Super Nintendo, there's like 1,200 games in here, and I seriously doubt that you want to play 1,200 Super Nintendo games. So you got a couple options here. You could take out all the games you don't want to play, or maybe just delete all of them and put your own in. That's typically what I would do, but obviously that's all going to be up to you. Either way, it is nice to see that it is very easy to add or remove ROMs from your SD card. Okay, so I think that's enough in terms of looking at what this handheld can do. Let's actually talk about how I feel about it. So we'll start with what I like and then talk about what I don't. To start, I think the device is surprisingly comfortable. It is really sturdy in the hand, and I think that durability goes a long way to making it feel like it has a high build quality. And like I mentioned, it's very similar to the Analogue Pocket in terms of just overall feel when you're holding it. I also think this device is priced right. It's $70. It's not quite knocking on something like the RGB30 at $90, but it's also, a good $5–10 more expensive than the Miyoo Mini Plus or the Anbernic RG35XX. All the same, this is surprisingly good performance for under $100. In fact, at $70, I really haven't seen anything that performs this well. When it comes down to it, I say the stock operating system is okay. I mean, it allows you to navigate through everything. It's a very simple interface. And I think in that regard, if you were to give this handheld to somebody who knows nothing about these devices, they can probably figure out their way around it. Now, that being said, there are quite a few things I don't like about the XU10, so let's talk about those next. Number one, I don't like the fact that we have a lack of configuration options. I would say that for 90% of users, it's not going to be an issue, but for the 10% who are tinkerers like me, I just like having the ability to change things as I'd like. For example, I don't like that startup sound. It is really loud and kind of annoying, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to figure out a way to make it quieter. I never thought this would be a problem I would have with a retro handheld, but here we are. Now, some of the things I've come to expect with a lot of retro handhelds released this year are some of those creature comforts, things like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, HDMI. And for better or for worse, none of those options are available on this handheld. Now, that may not bother you. For example, this is a pretty good offline handheld, something you could take with you on a plane trip or something like that. But all the same, I do like it when those extra features are at least available. And finally, my last note here is that I would be surprised if any custom firmware officially comes out for this device. As it stands, most of the developers who have worked on the RK3326 chipset have basically moved on. And so if anything, I think there might be some tweaks, maybe some community solutions where somebody can take an existing custom firmware and make it work on this device. But all the same, I would be surprised if we get something that's tailor-made for this device here and now. And the reality is that that's kind of a bummer because I think that custom firmware would make this device even better. Many times when I make a review like this on hardware that has just come out, all I'm really doing is assessing the hardware and seeing whether or not it's going to have a lot of potential. Because often, once a device becomes popular, then community support kind of rallies around it, and then usually at some point there will be a software experience update. And every once in a while, we'll get to this point where there's like this magical mix between the two. I think some really good examples would be like the Miyoo Mini Plus or the RG35XX, and even the old Anbernic RG351 devices were greatly improved with custom firmware. And so when it comes down to it, if the XU10 had come out a year or two ago, it probably would have been a huge hit. And even now, I would say that yes, this actually does warrant getting a custom firmware solution. Not only is it comfortable to hold and kind of sleek in the hand, but it has some of the best performance I've found in a vertical handheld over the past couple years. And I would say if you're not super picky about Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, PlayStation Portable, and Saturn, this actually makes those systems relatively playable. So really, when it comes down to it, do I recommend this device? It's going to be a kind of a yes and kind of a no. I would say that if you are okay with the stock experience that you saw here in this video, then yes, I think you will get exactly what you're going to pay for. And at $70, I think that the value here is definitely apparent. However, if you are looking for something to go toe-in-toe with the software experience like on the Miyoo Mini Plus, it's definitely not there. All the same, I'm going to definitely hold on to these units in case there is a software solution sometime in the future, because I do think this device has a lot of potential, and the more people that try it out will probably be equally impressed, and so we might see some more development in the future. Either way, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Is this right at that threshold where it's worth considering, or are we at the point where we just have too many options in the market? I can definitely see it going either way. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.